Story 1. When I first saw him, it was summer, and I had just finished 8th grade. It was a time when it seemed like your whole life was in front of you, and there was only a bright future ahead. But that was all before Charlie moved in next door. The house he and his parents moved into had once belonged to the McFarland family. I remembered their house, their high fence, their big windows, and the old yard with the rickety swing. But with the arrival of the new neighbor, a lot had changed. Charlie was not like everyone else who lived in our neighborhood. He was strange, a little sullen, with round glasses that made his big eyes seem even bigger. He was skinny and awkward, and his light, almost sandy hair was always sticking out in different directions. It was obvious even if you only saw him from afar. A couple of days after they moved in, my parents decided that we should go visit and introduce ourselves. My mom, dad, and I went over to their place, knocked on the door, and when his mom opened it, I knew that this day would be different from all the others. She was beautiful, with long blonde hair and a tired but kind look. She was nice to look at. She reminded me of the heroine of some old movie. Her name was Sally, and she immediately showed us that she was a nice and friendly person. His father was quite different. He was of medium height, with a balding head, and wore square-rimmed glasses. He was always polite, but his manner of speaking made me feel slightly awkward. His name was Randy, although he insisted on being called simply Mr. Wilkes. I, of course, always stuck to the formality and continued to call him Mr. Wilkes, hesitating to switch to a more friendly tone. Charlie was standing to the side at the time, watching us. I saw him come to the door and, looking at me, noticed that I was holding a baseball glove and a ball. He probably didn't expect anyone to ask him to play, but without thinking, I suggested that he play catch in the yard. I've always enjoyed playing baseball, and my new neighbor would be a great partner. His father, standing nearby, suddenly said something strange, addressing us, politely but with some reproach. "Please do not throw garbage next to this car," he pointed to the perfectly maintained 4.8 1967 Mustang. "Named it after my wife," he added, as if that was something important to be proud of. I nodded, but my curiosity flared. Why was he so serious about this car? Why did he pay so much attention to its preservation? Charlie and I began spending more time together. Over the next few weeks, whenever we had a free moment, we ran around the yard, played baseball, rode bikes, and discussed absolutely everything. When I went to his room, I was surprised to see how many model trains were on the shelves. There were railroad maps on the walls, and on the table were tools for building new models. He enthusiastically told me how different types of trains worked, their mechanisms and features, and although I had little interest in them, I couldn't help but notice how excited he was to tell me all this. Charlie often said that his dream was to become a train driver. No, he didn't just want to be one. No, he wanted to be a train. He often repeated this strange phrase, and it made me feel uneasy. It seemed to me a childish, naive fantasy. But his eyes lit up when he said it. It was not just a dream, but something more that made him live it. One day, sitting on the hill, I suggested an interesting idea to him. "You know, there's a place on the other side of town where we could watch the trains go by. The nice thing about this place is that the tracks run right next to the hill, and we could ride our bikes and watch the giant trains go by." Charlie, with his always sincere interest in trains, was immediately fired up by the idea, and soon we began going there every evening, where we would sit on the grass and watch the trains roar and roar past us. Each time it became stranger to me. It was as if he was in a trance when he watched the trains. It was as if his soul was disappearing into these metal giants, and he was part of this enormous force. At one point a stranger approached us. He was a man with no permanent address, dressed in shabby clothes with rough features. This Steve, as he introduced himself, asked if we had any money. I said no, but offered to bring him something to eat the next day, something simple like soup from a can. Steve said that would be nice. The next morning when we came back to the hill, Steve was already waiting for us. He did not disdain our snacks, and began to tell us strange stories about his life. He said how he often jumped on trains, saw the world from above, and was a part of the railways. Charlie listened to him more and more intently each time, and some strange determination appeared in his eyes. Charlie and I began seeing Steve more and more often, and I began to feel increasingly uneasy. Something about his stories was unsettling, but Charlie was completely absorbed in this man and his stories. I didn't understand what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling of fear and unease. And the strangest thing was that Charlie was starting to act differently. He said he wanted to be a machinist, but I no longer knew what that really meant. Charlie was becoming more and more strange with each passing day. At first I thought it was just a growing up thing where people start to change their interests, but now I wasn't so sure. He seemed to be becoming more and more absorbed in his world of trains, and his conversations were becoming more and more bizarre. He said that he wanted to not only be a train driver, but that he felt a connection with the trains, as if their spirit lived within him, and he needed to escape on their wings. Every morning, as soon as I walked outside, I would see Charlie sitting on the hill, listening to the sounds of the railroad tracks. It was as if he knew when the train would come and could descry each moment as it was in his head. He didn't just wait for the trains, he lived for them. There was something in his eyes that made me doubt his sanity. I tried to talk to him, bringing the conversation back to more normal topics. I reminded him of the importance of studying, playing soccer, or participating in school activities. But none of that seemed important to him. He was often silent, absorbed in his own thoughts, and seemed to have forgotten that things like friendship and life in the real world were important. He talked about his dream as if he was sure that all of this was not just a fantasy, but an inevitable reality that was waiting for him. One day, after school, I went to see Charlie to see how he was doing. We usually met in his room where he was busy assembling model trains. Today was not one of those days. He was not expecting me, and I found him in a strange state. He was sitting on his bed with all his model trains arranged around him. His face was gloomy, his eyes were sunken, and his breathing was heavy. He seemed not to notice me. His gaze was empty and cold. I came closer and sat down next to him. He didn't look at me, but suddenly said, "Have you ever thought that everything in this world is connected? That trains are not just machines. They are like guides, leading us to some truth, to some transformation." I felt a chill go down my spine. I knew Charlie was weird, but hearing him say it was scary. He said it with such confidence, like he actually believed it was true. Charlie suddenly stood up and walked over to one of his model railways. He carefully pulled out one of the models and, ignoring me, began to remake it. He was muttering something under his breath, something unintelligible, and I couldn't figure out what it meant. It was like a spell. I was at a loss. The next morning I couldn't shake this feeling of unease, a premonition of something. That day when I returned home from school, Charlie was no longer in the house. I went into his yard, but he was gone. I knocked on his parents' door, and Sally answered. She looked worried, but quickly hid her emotions. "Charlie's gone," she said, her voice tight as if she were trying to hide something more. "He went for a walk, but we can't find him." I felt a tightness in my chest. My parents and I started looking for him in the area, but we couldn't find him anywhere. My concern grew when I realized that I wasn't the only one who noticed something odd about his behavior. Charlie had been missing for several days. This was more than just a childish prank. At that moment, I realized that Steve was having more and more influence on Charlie. I didn't know what to do, but I felt that Steve was somehow the catalyst for all these changes. He wasn't just a homeless person, but somehow the source of this strange influence that had taken hold of Charlie. We couldn't find him, so I decided to meet Steve. A few days later, I saw Steve again. He was sitting by the train tracks, just like before. There was a strange sparkle in his eyes, and he smiled at me as I approached. I didn't know what to do, but there was something sinister about his presence. It became clear to me that this was not just some random drifter. There was more to him than met the eye. "Have you seen Charlie?" I asked, trying not to show my concern. Steve smiled, and there was a strange light in his eyes, like a man who knows more than he is telling. He said words that I have not been able to forget. "He is here. He will be where he is expected." I didn't know what that meant, but it made me feel even more afraid. Steve said it with such calm that I couldn't help but believe that there was something much more dangerous hidden behind those words. When I got home, I heard from my parents that Charlie was back, but he looked completely different. His mother said he was unbearably silent and didn't even acknowledge her. His father stood there, tense, but said everything would be okay. I didn't believe them. I didn't believe everything would be okay. I knew this wasn't just a teenage tantrum. It was something more serious. One night, a few days later, I went to see Charlie again. At times, it seemed to me that he was in another world. When I knocked on his door, it opened, and I saw him. He was alone, but his eyes were empty, like two huge empty tunnels through which the wind passed. There was no joy or sadness on his face, only emptiness. I didn't know what to do. Everything around me seemed foreign and dangerous. Charlie was not who I knew him to be. and with each passing day I felt more and more that his world had become alien to me. Several days had passed since I had seen Charlie at his home. He continued to avoid contact, and his strange behavior became more noticeable. I often saw him by the train tracks where he sat, as always, motionless, listening intently to every sound. Trains were no longer just a hobby for him. They had become part of his life, part of something bigger. It was not just a hobby, it was his destiny. Every time I approached him, he seemed not to notice me. It was as if he was in another world. There was nothing alive in his eyes. I no longer saw in them the boy with whom I had once played ball. Now there was something strange, frightening in them, as if he was consumed by something much more powerful than himself. And this world, this dark world that was engulfing him, seemed dangerous. More and more I began to feel that trains were not just a part of his life, but a part of something dark that lived inside him and controlled him. And if before it seemed to me that this was just a dream, now I understood that it was something more. It was like a curse that he could not ignore. One evening, as I sat on the hill watching the sun set and the dark shadows begin to fall, I noticed Charlie again. He was standing down below, right next to the tracks, looking at them as if he were waiting for something. His face was completely blank. His eyes seemed to be unaware of the world around him. At that moment, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It all felt wrong. It was all alien and frightening. Charlie didn't move. He was like a statue, and I couldn't understand what he was waiting for. The trains were passing by as usual, but now their rumble and whistles seemed ominous. They weren't just sounds. They were some kind of call that came from the depths of the railways to Charlie's very heart. I felt that everything that was happening around me was part of something much more terrible than I could imagine. I couldn't remain indifferent. I knew that if I hadn't approached him, if I hadn't tried to bring him back to reality, everything could have ended badly. But the closer I got, the more I felt myself being pulled into this dark world. It was becoming more and more engrossing, like a black funnel. I tried to call him, but he didn't hear me. He was like a ghost, absorbed in this world from which he could not escape. With each glance from him, it became clearer to me that he was no longer here. He was disappearing, absorbed in something that was beyond my ability to understand. In that moment, standing next to him, I realized that what was happening to him was far from a simple fascination with trains. It was something dark that was chaining him to those tracks, and it seemed that it was not going to let go. I wanted to leave, but my legs seemed not to move. I could not tear my eyes away from Charlie, from his empty eyes. I felt the coldness enveloping me, the pressure on my chest increasing, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for me to breathe. Suddenly, as if on cue, Charlie turned to me, and I saw his face change. It became hard as stone, and his eyes, the same eyes that had once sparkled with joy and curiosity, were now cold, empty, and lifeless. It wasn't just a lack of emotion. It was something else. It was like Charlie himself had disappeared. He had become something else, something that couldn't be a normal person. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. My feet dug into the ground, but I couldn't move. I felt panic rising in me, but also a strange calm. I stood before him as if the whole world had disappeared and there were only these tracks, this dark path, and Charlie, who was now a part of it. As the train appeared on the horizon, I felt the whole atmosphere around us change. The train, which had always been a part of this world, now seemed not just an iron machine, but something alive, something connected to Charlie, to his fate on these tracks. The train's whistle cut through the air, and I felt the sound penetrate me as if it were part of my own body. It was terrifyingly familiar. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, but as soon as I took a step back, Charlie took a step forward, and his figure merged with the iron tracks, as if he had become part of this machine, part of the train. I didn't know what was happening, but I saw him sinking deeper and deeper into this world, losing his humanity. I couldn't believe it, but I saw it with my own eyes. I ran. I didn't know where, but I had to go. Once I was out of sight, the rumble of the train died away, and the world returned to normal. But in my heart, I knew that Charlie was gone. That he was gone. All that was left were the empty iron tracks where trains had once rolled, and the memory of the man who had once been my friend. The next morning when I woke up, the feeling of what had happened was still there. Everything was as usual, but something inside me had changed. I felt heavy shadows following me, reminding me of Charlie, and his strange obsession with trains. There was no doubt that his connection to this world was something more dangerous than I could have imagined, but I couldn't get what I had seen on the tracks out of my head. Charlie was no longer an ordinary boy. He had become part of this world, part of something dark. I couldn't look at the tracks the same way anymore. Every time I walked up to them, it felt like there was an invisible force in the air, like something was pulling me along. But despite this uneasiness, I kept coming back to them. I couldn't stop thinking about Charlie, about what he had become and who he had been. There was the same light in his eyes as the train had when it sped down the tracks, never slowing down, past people, past trees, past everything that stood in its way. Trying to distract myself, I began searching for answers to my questions, but the more I looked, the less I understood. Charlie was said to have been a normal boy before he moved into our neighborhood. But everything changed when he met Steve. What connected these two? Why did Steve, who to me was a strange and mysterious homeless man, seem so important in Charlie's life? I felt this mystery pulling me into the dark corners of what I already knew, trying to fit all the pieces into place, but they just wouldn't make sense. As time went on, thoughts of Charlie haunted me. I began to notice strange things around me. Every time I passed the train tracks, it seemed as if something was watching me, following my every step, and more often I felt an invisible pressure on my neck. Every morning when I left the house, the first thing I did was look toward the hill, but Charlie was not there. His pale face was not there. His strange silence was not there. But I knew that this was not the end. One day as I was walking to school, I noticed a heavy foggy curtain rising up the road toward the tracks. It wasn't like the usual morning fog. It was thick, like smoke, and it seemed alive, as if it was getting into my lungs and wouldn't let go. I stopped for a few seconds and felt a strange excitement in my body, as if something close but alien was pulling me. I looked at the tracks. It was only a moment, but I clearly saw a figure emerge from the fog, a dark silhouette barely visible in the thick haze. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Charlie, but at that moment it seemed to me that it was someone who could have been him. I took a step back in panic and almost fell when I saw the figure moving toward the tracks, disappearing into the thick fog. My throat tightened and I realized that this moment was far from random. I was connected to this, just like Charlie. I ran around this city looking for answers, but the answers never came. They only brought more questions. After I experienced this strange incident, I began to fear that Charlie had not left after all. He was somewhere out there, in this world, in this darkness, and he was watching my every step. I began to listen more often to the sounds of the night, trying to understand what was happening in this place. Sometimes, when I was sitting in my room, I heard a distant train whistle, as if it was not traveling along the usual tracks, but on the way to my house. One day, after a long day, when I was beginning to lose hope that everything would return to normal, I heard that sound again. It was quiet, but persistent. At first, I thought it was just a train passing somewhere far away, but the sound grew louder, and I realized that it was coming right here, right towards me. I didn't know what to do, but instinctively I ran towards the train tracks. At that moment, I felt cold air fill my body, as if something had touched me. When I got to the top of the hill, I saw that the train was gone. But there was Steve. He stood in the fog like a shadow, and his eyes were as black as I remembered them. He was there in the same place where I had last seen him with Charlie. He was part of that shadow, part of that misty haze, and there was nothing human in his gaze. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The smell of sulfur was in the air, and when I turned, I felt him too close. Steve came closer, and I knew he knew. He knew how I felt, how I had survived, how Charlie had become part of this darkness, and maybe I had too. Steve came up to me and stopped. His dark eyes looked straight at me, and I realized that I would not be able to get out. This fog, this iron world, its dark power was too difficult to fight. I felt the fog coming over me, and I knew I would never leave this place again. Time seemed to stretch. Everything around me became unreal, as if the world had become blurred, indistinct. I stood on the hill, and the fog seemed to penetrate me, filling every cell of my body, pulling me along like an unknown force that could not be stopped. I could not understand what was happening, could not find meaning in what I was seeing. My eyes were fixed on Steve, who stood before me like a statue of shadow, swallowed up by time and space. I did not know whether he had become my enemy or a harbinger of what was to come, but I felt that he knew. He knew that I was afraid, knew that I had lost myself. His eyes, once dark, were now empty pits with tiny flames burning in them, like the eyes of an animal that had lost its humanity. I looked into them and was afraid, because I knew he was not human. He was something else, something ancient and terrible that existed in the shadows between worlds. I knew intuitively that he was part of something much larger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. He was a link, a bridge between this world and what was to come. But Steve wasn't the only one. I felt something bigger. It wasn't just fear. It was the realization that everything I knew was crumbling. Charlie, his strange obsession with trains, his sacrificial love for the railroad tracks, none of it was an accident. I knew that now that Charlie was gone, he lived on, but not as I knew him. I couldn't understand how I had ended up in this place, how I had become part of this world, but I knew one thing. I couldn't allow myself to remain the same. This world creeping in the shadows was rising, its fog sucking everything I knew out of me. It was sucking me out like a train that rushes along the tracks, never stopping or slowing down. Steve took a step forward, and I felt the air around me tighten. My lungs began to ache, and I could feel my blood growing heavy, as if it were being pulled toward those dark paths. I took a step back, but the fog, like an invisible wall, held me. I tried to breathe, but I couldn't. He stood so close that I could see his dark eyes taking in everything around him. He was like nothing, like shadow itself, and I knew that if I didn't run now, I would be trapped here forever. "Charlie?" I whispered, feeling his name ripple out of me. It wasn't just a word. It was a feeling I couldn't explain. I knew Charlie was here, that he was a part of this. And now, in this moment, I could feel his presence permeating everything. Steve chuckled and stepped closer, and I felt the fog grow thicker. I saw his dark eyes begin to glow, and his figure began to blur into the shadows. There was something strange, unnatural about his movements, like a creature that had transcended human nature. "He's not coming back," Steve said, his voice cold and deep like the echoes of some ancient evil. "He's been here for a long time, inside." I felt my legs buckling under me. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was a feeling that I was losing control of my body, that I was losing touch with reality. Inside me, there was a growing sense that I was standing on the threshold of something enormous, something that was impossible to comprehend, but that was already inevitable. I saw the fog growing thicker, and Steve dissolving into it, as if he were part of the air itself, and I knew I couldn't run from this. It wouldn't let me. But at that very second, I felt something happening. It was like a jolt, something awakened in me, and I began to move as if the air itself was lifting me, as if the rails I had once run on had become a part of me. The fog cleared again, and I realized this wasn't just a mind trick. This was reality. I was on those very tracks Charlie had talked about so often. I was standing among them, and they were guiding me. I knew I didn't have to be afraid. Suddenly everything was clear. This was my path on the iron rails, my place in this world. I was a part of it. And so, in that moment, when everything seemed settled, when the fog finally cleared and disappeared, I realized that Steve and Charlie were just the beginning. They were ghosts of the past, and I was the one who had to move on, and the train that had once seemed only part of their world was now my guide. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the fog was gone, and there was a train in front of me, and I knew it was mine. Story 2. That day was both bright and strange. We lay on the sand, just as so many others did on summer days, turning to the sky and deciphering the mysterious shapes of the clouds. I remember the warmth of the sun on my skin and the soft rustling of the waves in the distance. Ellie lay next to me, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes fixed on the sky. She always began our little ritual with the clouds, as if it were not just a pastime, but some important part of our summer rhythm that had no explanation. We both knew that every day on that beach would feel like our last, but we still played these strange games, exchanging imaginary interpretations of the clouds. I could say that clouds paint entire worlds. Seemingly ordinary forms became something much greater for us. Moments, stories, entire universes. Then we argued about what they could mean, made up incredible theories, looked for form in every swirl of the cloud, but despite all this ease, there was always some special moment when the sky pictures became something deeper for us. We looked in the clouds not just for forms, but also for the sensations, the thoughts they evoke. It was almost like art. We painted the clouds, and the clouds painted us. Today, on this last day of summer, I noticed that Ellie looked strange. It was more than just a little tired. I didn't know what it was, but there was something different about the way she looked. Usually she was full of ideas, jokes, bright images that poured out of her like rain. But today, everything was different. She was lost in thought, as if her thoughts had drifted away somewhere far away and she couldn't catch up. But I decided not to worry. It was the last day before school, and I thought she was probably just a little nervous. We all get a little nervous before new beginnings, so I tried to cheer her up a little, as usual. I looked up at the sky, and, of course, my head immediately filled with weird thoughts about what it could be. I looked at the clouds and decided to start the game. I said to her, trying to make my voice bright and excited, "Oh, baby, I swear to God, Mr. Clean is up there fighting a dinosaur. You should see." I said it with a smile, hoping she would at least smile back. It was almost like testing her reaction. And she did look up, but her gaze was a little different than I expected. She narrowed her eyes at the sky, but there was none of the amused sparkle that usually followed our banter. Instead, she looked like she was searching for something dark, something I couldn't quite place. I paused, unsure of what to say, and then she broke the silence. "The clouds are painting death." Those words somehow truly overshadowed my thoughts. I froze, not knowing how to react to them. Usually her words, even if they were strange, caused laughter or interest, but something was wrong here. She said it as if she actually saw something more in those clouds, as if the phrase itself had a much deeper meaning than I could understand. I tried not to show that I was worried, but doubts began to flicker in my mind. I looked up at the sky but saw nothing ominous. Everything was as usual. The clouds moved slowly, the shapes changed, the games went on. But Ellie had said those words, and now they echoed in my head. It seemed to me that there was some cold determination in her voice, something invisible and terrible that I could not ignore. At that moment, I tried to bring the conversation back to normal. I felt that we needed to return to our ritual because it was simpler, easier. I tried to pretend again that everything was fine. "What time will you pick me up for school tomorrow?" she asked suddenly, as if trying to distract herself from what she had been talking about earlier. I thought that maybe she really needed something to calm down, to get out of the state she was in. "Well, probably 7:20. Is everything okay?" I answered, watching her. She nodded slightly and smiled, but it was a strange, empty smile, not like before. She assured me that everything was fine, but there was still some tension in the air. And no matter how much I tried to bring some lightness back into the conversation, one phrase remained in my head: clouds paint death. That night when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't know what she meant, but it wouldn't go away. I kept thinking about it, and when I looked at the clouds, I saw something more in them than I had before. What might have been casual or cheerful now seemed dark and unforgiving. Maybe it was just a stressful day. Maybe I shouldn't have been so hung up on her words. But maybe it was the first moment I felt like there was something bigger, beyond all those clouds. Something we all fear, but can never see until it's too late. Ellie grew quieter with each passing day, like the fog that covers the world before a storm. I wanted to think it was just nerves about starting school, but the changes were becoming too noticeable to ignore. I kept watching her gaze become more distant, as if she was increasingly lost in her thoughts, oblivious to what was going on around her. These weren't just signs of fatigue. There was a shadow in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. She took less and less part in our games with the clouds, and she stopped laughing the way she used to. This strange silence was too loud. I continued to try to support her as best I could. I began to notice how she often became lost in thought, looking into the distance, as if her thoughts had been carried away somewhere far away. Sometimes, when I tried to talk to her about something ordinary, it was as if she was returning from some other planet, absorbed in something important that remained beyond my words. These moments worried me, but I convinced myself that this was just a harbinger of a new school year. We were all nervous. We were all worried. Something was changing. One day I noticed her looking at her hands, as if she was trying to figure out what was wrong with them. She would often sit alone, lost in her thoughts, and it seemed to me that she was searching for answers to questions I couldn't understand. I would ask her what was going on, but she would only give short answers, assuring me that everything was fine. But in her words, I could sense a tension lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't just a lack of her usual vivacity, but something much deeper. She was hiding something that prevented her from being the same. My anxiety grew. I tried to think that all this was just a normal reaction to stress, but gradually I began to notice that something was really going on, not in her soul, but in her body. And when she stopped eating again, when she was often overcome by fatigue, I realized that I could not ignore these symptoms. I felt that it was time to finally talk to her seriously, but I did not know where to start. She asked me to take her to the hospital. It wasn't sudden, but it was a bolt from the blue. We went, and when I saw the look in her eyes that night as she stood in the hospital corridor, I knew I would never forget that moment. It was a look of despair, of complete understanding that something was going to happen, and that something was inevitable. We met with the doctors and they started doing tests. I still hoped that it wouldn't be that bad, that we would get off with a light fright. But the diagnosis came quickly and it was terrifying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I remember sitting in the empty office, listening to those words, trying to understand what was happening, but they didn't seem to touch me. It sounded like an abstraction, like some terrible misunderstanding that had to be a mistake. But when I looked at her face, I realized there had been no mistake. There was an emptiness in her eyes, the same shadow that had begun to fill her in recent weeks. Now, I saw that that shadow wasn't just a reflection of her feelings, but something much deeper, something she had already faced. Over the next few weeks, the world around me seemed to blur. I began to realize that she was struggling with something much bigger than her illness. We were both consumed by this horror, this disproportionate and incomprehensible evil that was invading our lives like an unknown enemy. I tried to be there for her, but when her eyes went blank, I felt like I was on the other side of the world. I couldn't help her as much as I wanted to, and that feeling of helplessness was eating away at me. Every day was filled with struggle, but at some point I began to understand that her life, despite all its brightness and love, was doomed. She was changing, and I could not bring her back. We continued to fight, but the more I looked at her face, the more it became clear to me that these changes were not just physical. She was becoming different, internally going somewhere, moving away, and it seemed that I was losing her right before my eyes. One dark night, as I sat next to her in the hospital room, I remembered again the words she had spoken on the beach. The clouds paint death. It seemed to me that this prediction, which she could not understand that day, had become her truth. Those words now haunted me. I saw death not only in her eyes, but in her every movement, in her every breath. It was more than just an illness. It was a perception of the world that she had accepted as part of herself. With each passing day, I felt more and more how death was becoming a part of her existence, and therefore a part of mine. Everything connected to her was no longer just time and moments, but something much heavier. I saw that sky, I saw the clouds again, but they were no longer pictures and had no play in them. They had become harbingers of what was to come. Time continued to move forward, as it does in any world where people struggle with the inevitable. I couldn't help but feel death creeping closer, surrounding me, slowly and inexorably enveloping Ellie, consuming her. We all experience this feeling at one point or another, but rarely do we recognize it so clearly. In a strange way, as she continued to struggle, something within me became more and more aware of the fact that life itself had abandoned us. It wasn't despair, but something heavy and endless that hung in the air. Ellie's illness was not sudden. It was a long and painful process that was swallowing her up, turning her former vitality into shadows, into fading lights. We couldn't fight it, and I, as always, tried to find something that would allow us to somehow return to that world where the clouds were simple, cheerful, and carefree. But that world was long gone. There was no place for death in that world. In our world, it was here, and it never went away. Every day was the same as the previous one, but more and more painful. I kept seeing her tired eyes as she sat in a chair and looked out the window, where the clouds moved slowly, as if they themselves knew that she was losing strength. More and more often, I felt how my own perception was beginning to change. If before I could look at the clouds, notice fantasies, games in them, Everything was different now. I could not help but notice how the clouds were filled with ominous shapes that only I could see. It was like a disease that was creeping into my mind, making me see things that were not there. I began to notice how the clouds were changing before my eyes. They were no longer simple, pleasant pictures. I would look up at the sky and see buses piercing empty space, as if someone was trying to paint disasters in the air. One day, as I was rushing to class, I looked up and saw a shape I couldn't place. It was a cloud that resembled a bus with a front tire crushing the head of a figure. The shape was so clear and vivid that it left no doubt. It was something that shouldn't be in the sky. It wasn't a cloud, but a picture painted in the air itself, and I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. I pushed these thoughts away, trying to explain to myself that this was just a trick of the mind, that all of this was just abstractions, imaginary pictures. But these images did not go away, and with each new look at the clouds, I felt their presence in my life more and more, as something that not only conveyed the atmosphere, but also seemed prophetic. It was not a perception of the world, but some inner feeling that everything happens for a reason. But I could not fully understand what it meant. I just knew that death was near. A few days passed, and I encountered the same feeling again, the same sense that everything was connected. I was so caught up in these thoughts as I walked through the university campus that I barely noticed a biker pass me, almost knocking me over. I glanced back at him as he sped down the bike path, thinking how unfortunate it was that he was going so fast that he was on the brink of danger. But then something caught my attention. He had sped past another intersection and the pedestrian hadn't reacted in time. It all happened so fast that the biker didn't have a chance to realize what had happened before his front bike slammed into the pedestrian. The sight of this incident took me by surprise and I froze. The next second, while the biker still did not understand what had happened, his body was gone and I saw how the approaching bus, huge and scary, tore his life apart. It was like the scene I had seen on the cloud, like a picture, only now it had become reality. I could not understand what was happening, but at that moment everything, the clouds, the disasters, the coincidences, merged into one. I felt that this was not just a coincidence, that there was something more to these events. It could not be a simple coincidence. I remembered looking at the clouds and seeing the same thing happen right in front of me. The more I experienced these events, the more it became clear to me that I could not escape this connection. All these tragedies, all these strange visions were not accidental. I saw how the clouds painted death, and now I understood that they did not simply reflect the world, but predicted it. I could not stop thinking about it, and a few days later, when I raised my head again to look at the sky, I saw another image in the clouds. This time it was especially vivid. It was an airplane falling into the sea. The shape was clear, although the sky was clear and blue, and there was no sign that anything was about to happen. 2 days later, disaster struck. Flight 180 from Los Angeles never made it to Hawaii. It disappeared from radar, and its black box was found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And in that moment, I realized that clouds don't just paint pictures. They paint destinies. Everything I knew about the world had changed. Every morning, when I left my house, it was as if I was entering another world, where death was always close, invisible but tangible. I could no longer enjoy the simple things that had once seemed so important. Everything had become gray, like a frozen fog that slowly descends on the earth, filling it with cold and emptiness. My perception of reality was distorted, as if each day was just part of a nightmare that repeated itself over and over, giving no chance to wake up. Every glance at the sky became a heavy burden for me. I stopped seeing in the clouds the images that used to make me laugh, be happy, feel light. Now I saw in them only ominous shapes, shadows that hid unimaginable tragedies. Soon I realized that the clouds had become part of my subconscious, a reflection of what was happening inside me, parts of my fear and pain that I tried to suppress, but they came out. I couldn't forget Ellie's look, her words. She looked at the clouds as if she saw in them not just pictures, but some kind of signs, warnings, and now I knew that she was not mistaken. These were not just abstractions, they were harbingers, part of the reality that I did not want to accept. These clouds, these shadows in the sky, seemed to tell me that everything that was happening to us was not accidental. All the events were connected, and I sank deeper and deeper into this realization. Every day I became more and more withdrawn. I hardly communicated with people. I stopped noticing how the world around me was changing. Everything that was happening around me became indifferent to me. I saw how everything related to life faded into the background. People continued to go their own way, joke, smile, but I could not share their joy. I saw death in the clouds. I saw it in every chance meeting, in every incident. And this life, with its noise, its superficial joys, seemed to me something false, of no importance. I kept seeing these images, and they wouldn't let go. The images of seeing death crash into other people's lives were still etched in my mind. The bus that crushed the biker, the plane that crashed into the sea. It was all in the clouds, and now I knew that these were not accidents. I knew that at some point I would have to face it, and there was no point in trying to escape. I stopped looking at the sky, tried not to notice the clouds, tried to limit my perception, not to let them influence me anymore. But the more I tried to avoid them, the more they became a part of my life. These images could not be forgotten. They continued to haunt me in every moment, in every turn of fate. I could no longer distinguish where reality ended and fantasy began. And then one day, on another walk, I looked up again, as if something was pulling me toward the sky. I felt the air turn cold, as if everything around me had frozen. In the clouds I saw fragments of memory, images that haunted me. They were blurry, as if they were escaping my consciousness, but one thing was clear. It was a scene I could not understand, a strange shape, reminiscent of large shadows, as if something or someone was being swallowed by this cloud. I felt something squeeze inside me. Was this another omen? Death again? But what exactly does it bring? What sacrifice does it demand? I stood there looking at that sky, unable to move. My heart was constricted by a premonition, but I couldn't explain to myself what it meant. It seemed to me that I was living in some strange, cruel dream that never ended, and in that dream, the clouds became my only companions. They led me through all that horror, through every death I saw, through every moment when the world seemed unbearable. I realized that I could no longer ignore what was happening around me. These images were not only a part of me, but they were my reality. I began to realize that maybe I was meant to accept this. Maybe it was my destiny to live in a world where clouds painted death, and to search for a meaning in it that I could not understand. But despite all these thoughts, despite the fact that I was trying to come to some kind of inner understanding, I knew that I was not ready to accept my fate. I kept looking for answers, kept trying to figure out what to do with it, how to find a way to cope with it. I still didn't know what to do with what was haunting me. But one thing was clear. I could no longer live in this constant state of anxiety and fear. I felt my thoughts becoming cloudy, and I found it hard to breathe. I saw those clouds again, as if they were trying to convey something important to me, something I couldn't quite understand. I knew that death was still there, and that it wouldn't let me go, but what should I do about it? What should I do to find peace within myself? I didn't know how to live with this feeling. It was as omnipresent as the air I breathed, but it no longer brought me relief. I couldn't shake the idea that the clouds Ellie loved so much had become part of me, an integral part of how I now saw the world. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of this world, where every glance at the sky became a portent. I tried to find normality, as if hoping that one day this anxiety, this fear would disappear. But the days passed, and I continued to cling to desperate attempts to return to the old reality. I tried to joke again, to laugh, to enjoy the ordinary things that I once loved so much. I went to cafes, met with friends, but all these attempts were in vain. I could no longer feel joy. All that was left was emptiness, filled with clouds that painted death in my life. Gradually, I realized that this anxiety that was haunting me was not just fear, but some hidden knowledge that I could not ignore. I knew that at some point I would have to face it, to accept that death was not something that was happening somewhere out there far away from us. It was part of every step, every look, every detail. I felt it penetrating my consciousness, my soul, forcing me to be in a state of constant readiness. I began to feel like the world around me was becoming alien. Nothing I did felt satisfying. I experienced everything in dull, gray tones, as if I could no longer perceive the brightness of life. I noticed how the world around me was beginning to fade, as if everything I knew and loved was dissolving. I could only remember moments with Ellie, when we laughed and looked at the clouds, when it seemed like the world was simple and understandable. But those days were gone. Everything was destroyed by what had happened, by what had become our reality. I didn't know how to live my life. I didn't know how to let her go, how to let go of the death that continued to haunt me through the clouds, through every event, through every glance at the sky. At some point I realized that I needed to find a way to let it go, to accept that everything that was gone, and not to bring it back. Ellie was gone, and with her, a part of me was gone. One day I went to the beach we often visited, sat on the sand, looked at the clouds, and laughed. The place had become almost sacred to me, as if it were a link between what had been and what is now. I sat down on the sand, looked up, and saw the clouds. They were the same as before, changing shapes that seemed playful and light, but this time I didn't see them as a harbinger of dread. I didn't see them as death. They were just clouds. And then I realized that maybe I needed to finally let go of the fear, let go of the anxiety. I realized that the clouds no longer painted death. They just existed, like everything else. My life didn't have to be in the shadow of death, didn't have to be forever overshadowed by this sense of ending. It was hard to accept, but I realized that everything I had experienced had become a part of me, and I needed to move on. Ellie was a part of my world, but she was no longer here, and I had to learn to live despite her absence. I stayed on the beach for a long time, just sitting in silence and watching the clouds. I allowed myself to feel the world around me taking shape again. I knew I couldn't bring it back, but I could learn to live without that constant fear that death was always there. I could allow myself to see the world again as a place where life still existed, despite everything that had happened. At some point, the clouds began to disperse, and the sky became bright and clear. I looked at it and smiled. Not because everything was fine, not because I had found answers to all my questions, but because I finally understood. Death does not paint the future. It is just part of the path we all go through. We cannot avoid it, but we can learn to live with the fact that it is a part of life. I stood up from the sand and headed home, knowing that this was goodbye. Goodbye to what I feared, to what held me captive in fear. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was ready to move forward, one step at a time, despite everything. The clouds no longer painted death. Now they simply painted sky. Story 3. My name is Leo, and 8 months ago my life was shattered into 1,000 pieces. Not figuratively, it was literally shattered. Shattered by a car that slammed into mine. I was behind the wheel, and I remember the lights on the dashboard flashing, the dark shape of the car almost in slow motion as it pulled out to meet me. I remember the clanking of metal, the sounds of life compressed into one nightmarish second. I remember losing consciousness and everything going black. When I came to, I was lying in silence. Silence. All around me was the hospital bed, the smell of sterile sheets, the gleam of white walls that reflected the light. There was no smell of Clara, no rustle of her breath. I didn't know she was dead. At that moment, I knew nothing. I just lay there, and everything was black and cold and empty. It's not that hard to get over, really. Loss. You see the pain in it, but it's not concrete. It's abstract. You don't feel it in your body. But when they told me I'd never see the world again, that's when it really hit me. They say you have to learn to live again. They say time is your best friend in this process, but none of that matters if you don't understand how to perceive the world. It all felt so strange. I had always been someone who relied on sight. My sight was my foundation, and now it was gone. Just darkness, absolute emptiness. I felt the silence wash over me, like the little sounds of the world that I hadn't noticed before were suddenly deafening. There was too much of them. When I returned to our apartment, the apartment where Clara and I had spent our days before everything had fallen apart, I expected it to be a safe zone, a place I could understand, remember. I knew every crack in the floor, every detail, every rustle. It seemed like that would be enough to feel like home again. I began to live in a familiar space despite the darkness. I returned to this apartment every day, listening to the sounds, the clicks in the floor, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator. I knew where everything was, where the table was, where my mobile phone was, where the window with the moon was, and where the dark corner was. These sounds became my landmarks. My cane became my best friend. I got used to it, day after day. I got used to this new world in which I was completely absorbed and dependent on my other senses. I was learning to find my way again. I counted my steps. I knew that there were 17 steps from my bed to the bathroom, and 12 from the chair to the kitchen. But then things started going wrong. It wasn't straight away, little things at first. Then there were too many of them, and I couldn't ignore them. One day, standing in the hallway, I noticed that something was wrong with the floor. I walked along it, expecting to hear the usual sound of my cane hitting the wooden surface, but at some point I heard a strange, muffled knock. It was kind of soft, as if I was walking on a thick carpet, although I knew for sure that there was no carpet here. I stopped and started checking, to no avail. The floor was hard, cold, as always, but the strange feeling did not leave me. It was irritating. I kept walking, hoping that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I could not get rid of this feeling that the sounds had changed. Then, the fridge. I was sitting in the living room, listening to an audiobook, when I suddenly realized that my fridge wasn't making the usual hum. Silence. It wasn't just silence. It was a silence that was oppressive, that made me feel empty in my very chest. I walked into the kitchen. Steps, 12 steps. I even felt the air change as I walked that way. I opened the door, and the hum was back. The sound was normal, as always, but there it was. The feeling that it had been swallowed by the silence before I walked in. I looked around again, even though I knew nothing had changed. There was no other fridge here, but the hum was strange. I tried to rationalize it all. Trauma, stress, perhaps auditory hallucinations, maybe something else. But no, I couldn't shake this strange feeling that something here in my apartment had changed. Not just the sounds, everything. And then there were the cold spots. It was so strange. My apartment is old. There are often drafts, and I know where exactly. Under the door, under the windows. But one day, walking down the hallway, I felt a sudden chill on my cheek. I froze, turning, trying to find the source. But there was nothing. No windows, no draft. It was as if someone had passed by. I felt it, the cold, something invisible, nearby, and I couldn't explain it. The next morning I felt the cold again, but this time on my neck, as if someone was breathing right next to me. I tried to turn around, but everything around me remained silent and empty. It was unsettling, but the worst thing was that it seemed as if the very geometry of the apartment began to change. I would stretch my hand toward the wall near the bed, and suddenly my hand was further than usual. Not much, but enough for me to feel that something was wrong here. Or was I wrong? It couldn't be. The wall was smooth. I knew this place. But at that moment, something inside me was pulsating anxiously. Sound began to change my reality. I heard it where it shouldn't have been. It seemed as if I heard someone walking around the kitchen although I was in another part of the apartment, or the sound of water when I was far from the shower, and always these strange clicks that didn't fit into the picture. The impossible began to become reality, and I couldn't do anything about it. I knew I just had to hang on. I was getting used to it, but sometimes in the darkest moments it became almost unbearable. Every sound, every rustle, every change made me doubt myself, my perception. Maybe it was just me, but when I looked back at my life, at what I had lost, at what I had become, I began to believe in something more. In this apartment, in her, who now seemed to live her own life. Or maybe it was me. Living with silence was difficult, but it was becoming familiar. Every day I continued to do everything I could to not give in to panic, to simply exist. I learned new ways to navigate, developed my own techniques, listened to what I could hear to understand what was happening around me. Sounds became my eyes. They filled the space, creating a picture of the world in which I was deprived of what gave me confidence. Without visual references, I was left alone with this sound world. Sometimes I felt like I was too dependent on them. It was like a vicious circle. I heard everything, and the more I heard, the more entangled I became in these sounds. They weren't just sounds. They became something bigger than I could control. Every time I entered the apartment, the first thing I did was listen to what was going on around me. I knew how my neighbor walked on the landing. I knew what kind of knocking sound was heard when someone put their keys on the kitchen table. I knew the rhythm of life in this house. But lately this rhythm had begun to change. It was as if something was disrupting the usual order of things. Strange sounds, rustlings that did not fit into my understanding of reality. The kitchen became the place where I felt most insecure. Something inexplicable was happening there. A few days passed and I began to notice something. It wasn't voices or words I could hear, it was just a hint of something more. A subtle, almost invisible sound that couldn't exist under normal circumstances. Sometimes I felt the air in the room tighten, as if someone was quietly entering. I couldn't believe it, but every time I approached the kitchen door, something in the air changed. There was no figure, no footsteps, just a feeling of someone watching, present. I had become so accustomed to being alone that these moments became increasingly unbearable. I tried to ignore them, telling myself they were just my imagination. But a voice inside me said, "You are not alone." One day I felt that strange chill again when I walked into the hallway, as if someone had passed me again. The same chill I felt on my cheeks or on my neck. It wasn't like a normal draft. It was as if it wasn't just temperature, but something denser, invisible, with its own essence. I froze, listening, trying to figure out where this feeling was coming from. That night, as I lay in bed, I suddenly realized that I couldn't relax. The apartment was silent, but this silence was strange, as if something invisible was waiting. I tried to delve into my thoughts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something invisible that had long existed in this apartment, simply living its own life. This voice in my head wouldn't let go. It kept repeating, "You are not alone." I got out of bed and without turning on the light, moved toward the kitchen. I knew that every step was a new challenge for me. The silence grew louder, but I kept going, certain that, despite all my doubts, I had to deal with this. It wasn't just a vague feeling that something was wrong. It was like a quiet, almost imperceptible presence, as if someone was standing next to me, almost touching my shoulder. When I opened the kitchen door, I felt my heart sink. Everything was the same, but the silence, it was frightening. I stood in the doorway, listening to every little sound. Everything in the kitchen was the same as before. The refrigerator, the stove, the table, nothing had changed. But I knew something was wrong. I stepped inside, carefully, slowly, listening to every step, and then I heard it. A sound barely noticeable, like a click, coming from the floor, like something small was moving around the room, something that shouldn't be there. It was impossible. I was standing still, but the sound seemed to be coming from under the table. I walked slowly, trying not to step on anything unnecessary, and then I realized that the floor under the table was different than usual. It was soft. I leaned down, running my hand over the surface of the floor. It was like a little softer than the rest of the apartment, like there was something underneath it, something unfamiliar. I lifted the table, checking it out, and felt something move underneath it. It was something strange. It was as if the floor under the table was alive. I tried to bend the boards back, but then it hit me. I can't just think I'm imagining it anymore. Something in this house has changed. I decided to go back to my room to collect my thoughts. All my steps were cautious, as if I was walking through a minefield where every shadow could be a trap. My senses were becoming more and more acute. I felt every movement of air, every sound, but it still did not bring me peace. And then I realized, if I don't figure out what's going on here, I could lose everything. Maybe not my sight, maybe something much more important. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew. With each passing day, the sounds became stranger, more and more inexplicable. This sense of presence that I tried to ignore began to grow. When I returned to the apartment, I no longer felt that familiar comfort. The sounds that had previously been neutral, ordinary, began to take on a different form. It was neither a whisper nor footsteps, but something alarming. The same cold that I had previously felt in the hallway was now everywhere. It seemed to be pursuing me. I began to notice that the walls of my apartment were somehow closer. At first, I didn't pay attention to it, but later, when I came across a corner of the wall in the dark, it seemed to me that I had to take a couple more steps to reach it. It was so strange and unnatural that I no longer felt confident that I was orienting myself correctly. My home became shaky, like a mirage that was constantly changing. I was beginning to doubt my perceptions. I knew my brain was still recovering from the trauma, but how could that affect things like the geometry of the apartment? I couldn't understand why everything was suddenly changing. It seemed like the space wasn't just shrinking or expanding. It was adjusting to something I couldn't understand. It was even stranger in the kitchen. At one point I was standing at the sink when a sound dissonance sounded in my ears. The water was flowing as usual, but suddenly it began to sound strange, like echoes of an old chord, unnatural, as if each dripping sound was superimposed on some invisible background. When I listened, it seemed to me that a barely audible whisper was beginning to come from the walls. I froze in place, trying to understand what it was, but everything was quiet, just a deafening silence and the familiar sound of water. I tried to convince myself that it was just mental health issues, the aftermath of trauma. I'd heard my therapist talk about it. It's all part of recovery. The brain doesn't always respond well to change. But what I was hearing wasn't a typical auditory hallucination. It was something else, something conscious, something I couldn't explain. Then I started recording these moments using my phone. I would put it on the table next to my bed at night, checking every sound, every little thing. The anticipation would come with the silence of the night. I would turn on the recording and try to fall asleep, but sometimes, even in moments when I thought everything was fine, I felt a presence. It was so obvious that I began to doubt reality itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, that someone was always there. I started listening to the tapes that morning, searching for some kind of explanation. I could hear sounds on some of the tapes, whispers, clicks, breathing, but none of it could explain why I felt like I was in the company of someone invisible. It was especially noticeable when I listened to moments of silence. I could hear it in such detail that its density literally pressed against my eardrums. One morning as I was listening to the recording, I suddenly heard something I hadn't expected. Around 3 a.m, when the silence was especially thick, I heard a faint click. It was so quiet that I almost didn't notice. But then the sound came again, a soft click, like someone tapping a fingernail on a phone screen. But I was alone in the room. No one else could be nearby. My heart started beating faster. I listened to this moment several times. The click was sharp, almost physically perceptible, but its source remained unknown. I searched the entire room to make sure that nothing had knocked, but nothing. Everything was in place. It seemed that this sound was some kind of signal that I could not decipher. After that, I started to notice even more strange things. When I put the phone on the nightstand, I felt a light puff of air on my nose. I quickly looked around, but as always, there was no one in the room. I started to look for an explanation for these sensations, but the more I tried, the more I sank into this darkness of doubt. My blindness was only one part of the problem, but the feeling of this unknown force hiding in the dark corners of the apartment became more and more frightening. Every time I felt the cold spots on my skin or heard the whispers that were barely audible, I began to think that this wasn't just my injury, it was something else. Something inside me was breaking down, and that something was connected to what was happening in that apartment. My mind, unable to cope with grief and loss, began to distort reality. It was as if my own senses were failing me, filling the emptiness around me not with what was real, but with what I feared. I went back to the recording and heard the same whisper again, faint as before. But now I was sure it wasn't coming from me. It was something alive. It was someone who was present in this apartment. Several days passed, but the feeling that I was not alone in this apartment did not leave me. I began to avoid my usual routes around the house. Every morning I woke up with the thought that I would have to relive this day again, a day in which every movement could lead to an unimaginable sensation, as if the walls were starting to move and noise became something more than just a part of reality. I checked every recording I made on my phone. In some of them there was a strange sound, but it wasn't as distinct as before. It blended into the silence as if it were part of it, and this silence, oppressive and thick, became heavier with each passing day. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps, but when I stopped, there were no tracks. It was just in my head, in my memory, in this terrible feeling that someone was always there. As I walked around the apartment, I noticed that I no longer felt the same confidence I once had. Before, every step was part of a map of my world that I knew by heart. I knew where the walls were, where the furniture was, where important landmarks were. Now I often lost my way, found myself at doors I didn't expect to see, or stepped on things that weren't supposed to be there. I began to wonder more and more about what was happening to my senses. Everything that had seemed familiar was now becoming foreign and dangerous. The space around me was losing its shape. It felt like the walls were closing in and then suddenly expanding, as if they were trying to grab me. I didn't know what to believe, and all the while I kept hearing the same sound. faint breathing. It grew louder but always faded as I tried to track it down. Sometimes it seemed to be right next to my ear. I cursed my blindness, my helplessness. All I could do was wait, listen, but there was more to it than just silence. Something elusive, as if I were trapped somewhere and the space around me was an illusion hiding something much darker. I tried talking to Sarah again. She was supportive, but her words were always too logical, too rational, to make sense of what was happening in my apartment. She believed that this was all part of the healing process, that everything I was feeling was a consequence of the trauma. But every time I was alone in the apartment again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The silence became too loud. Rustles and sounds began to seem unnatural, as if dark forces were hiding in dark places I couldn't see. The sounds from the refrigerator continued to break their usual rhythm, becoming strangely irregular. I stood in the kitchen and listened as the flames of the burner on the stove sometimes seemed to die down and then return to their normal shape. It was almost as if something or someone was changing the space, making it more unsettling. Every day I became more and more confused in my own reality. Sometimes I was sure that all this was just the consequences of the trauma, but then I felt the space changing again. The feeling that someone was nearby became stronger and stronger. At night, things got even worse. My mind kept consuming me, and I began to forget where my reality ended and the one I had imagined began. It was a nightmare that never ended. Every time I went to sleep, it seemed to me that I was not just lying in my bed, but in some terrible place where there was no time, no space, no exit. I checked the recordings on my phone again. Night, silence, and again that sound, faint breathing. But now, every time I listened to it, it became more than just creepy. I began to feel like that breathing wasn't just there, it was trying to tell me something. I didn't know how to explain it. It was as if someone was waiting for me to hear it, but it kept disappearing as soon as I tried to figure out what was going on. And then I realized that this wasn't just a hallucination. This wasn't just my mind struggling with loss. This was something more sinister than I could have imagined. It felt like everything around me was changing, because I wasn't the only one in this apartment anymore. I wasn't sure I could trust my own perceptions, but one thing was clear. These oddities, these whispers and breathing were not random. Someone or something was living here with me. My apartment was no longer just a place. It had become a trap. Everything became hazy. The space I once knew by heart now felt alien. It wasn't just images, it wasn't just shapes that I couldn't discern. Everything around me, the floors, the walls, the furniture, merged into a shifting mass where shapes became blurry, sounds distorted. My memory, which had once been the foundation on which I relied, now seemed as empty as the space I was trying to remember. Everything I knew was disappearing, as if the walls themselves were changing shape and rhythm. This space no longer had rules, and I found myself in the face of absolute helplessness. The days were mixed together like in a nightmare that did not want to finish its run. I no longer knew what was happening to reality and what to my perception. Was it the result of trauma, a dark stream of thought that was pulling me into its abyss, or was something really happening to this apartment? I could not answer for sure. I stopped thinking about checking, writing down, or analyzing anything. Those nights, those recordings, all of it became one long, endless stream of sound, where all my attempts to understand what was happening only reinforced the feeling that I was losing the most important part of myself. I listened to the same recordings as before, and each time they sounded a little different. Everything became a little more real, and at the same time, even more absurd. The strangest thing was that, despite my blindness, I increasingly felt that the space around me was undergoing some strange metamorphosis. The walls would suddenly shrink and then expand, as if the apartment itself were changing its proportions to accommodate my fears. I felt the space becoming dangerous, as if it were alive and ready to swallow me whole. I could no longer trust my senses. All I could do was wait, but waiting only made things worse. The sounds I heard became unbearable. Sometimes they appeared out of nowhere, as if the apartment was exhaling something dark, invisible, that wrapped itself around me. At some point, I began to realize that I wasn't just hearing these sounds, but also feeling them, like they were vibrating in the air. They were becoming part of my skin, my body. It was as if everything around me had acquired a will of its own, and I could no longer control time or space. I tried to talk it out. Sarah kept calling me more and more often, asking how I was feeling, but her voice was no longer comforting. I talked to her, but she kept repeating the same words. She couldn't understand what was happening to me. She said that I couldn't live like this, that I needed to go back to the doctor, that I needed professional help, but I knew that no doctor could pull me out of this shadow that had begun to haunt me in the apartment. In the evenings, I checked my notes again. One day, I listened to them when it was dark, and then, as never before, I realized that the sounds I was hearing couldn't just be part of my head. Something was wrong. I could hear breathing. But it was different now. It wasn't just weak. It was desperate, as if someone needed help. I threw the phone on the table, and my body, as before, tensed in response to the sound. My hands shook as I tried to understand what it was. I sat in the dark, not knowing what to do. I was alone, absolutely alone, and all I could do was try to survive in this silence. Then something strange happened. I heard breathing again, but it wasn't just a sound. It was familiar, some long-forgotten, sick familiarity. I froze. I knew that sound. I knew what it sounded like. It was the breathing I had once heard next to me when Clara was there. I had heard it when her breathing became ragged, when she fell asleep and felt her body relax heavily. It wasn't just a sound. It was a memory that was now alive in my apartment. I tried to reach for it, as if I could grasp it, but it was fading away like fog. I felt the emptiness that surrounded me, and I realized that it wasn't just my memory. It wasn't just grief that was mixed with trauma. It was an echo of her presence. My head was spinning. I felt the space around me shrinking, as if this emptiness was trying to swallow me whole. I tried to stand, but I felt my body resist. With every step I took, I felt the walls shift, change shape. This wasn't just my psyche. This was my world. It was turning into a labyrinth in which I lost my bearings. Couldn't I have always been here? Couldn't this place be something I had created, something my pain had forced upon me? I didn't know where it would end, but in that moment I realized one thing. My apartment wasn't just me anymore. Every day I was losing my ability to see the world around me, and perhaps I didn't even notice how the world was changing. I was further and further from what I knew. All I could do was surrender to this changing space that would always be with me. Story 4. The summer of 2014 was the beginning of something I'd rather forget. I've always been a person who was looking for new adventures and opportunities. I was 19, and like many people that age, I was looking for independence, for a new experience that would change my life. That's why when my old friend Logan offered me a job at a sleepaway camp in northern Michigan, I didn't think twice. It seemed like the perfect fit. Free food, easy money, and, as he said, the best summer of your life. Little did I know, his idea of the best summer was something completely different. When I arrived at the camp, I was immediately struck by its remoteness. Fernmore Camp was hidden among tall pine trees, far from any roads, in a place with no communications, and generally felt like a place stuck in time. There were no luxurious air-conditioned cabins as I had expected. Everything was simple, rough, and perhaps even a little forgotten. There was a lot of dust everywhere, and at night the annoying mosquitoes literally ate us alive. But this didn't seem to be anything unusual for the locals. These people were used to living like this, and I understood that here you had to not only work, but also survive. The camp itself was old and run down. The wooden cabins had cracked walls and rotted roofs in places. Logan and I were counselors for a group of 6 kids, ranging in age from 10 to 12. The job seemed simple. Watch the kids, organize games and outings, and keep them entertained. It was pretty much the standard camp schedule I'd encountered before. But despite all the natural delights, the atmosphere was strange. There was a heaviness to the forest where we worked, as if the forest itself was hiding something, and the camp, though it had been there for decades, was an invisible stain on the land. Before I came here, I never even questioned why the camp was closed in the early 90s because of a missing child. Logan was strangely quiet when I asked him about it. He would just brush it off briefly, saying that these things just happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. Logan was strange in general, especially at night. When we were sitting around the fire and the kids were playing their usual games, he would often look out into the dark woods with an expression like he was watching something out there. I didn't tell him about it, but I felt like there were things going on at this camp that no one spoke about out loud. The first week passed quite calmly. The children got used to the surroundings and began to feel comfortable. They played, joked, did things typical camp spirit. However, the night when everything changed came quickly, July 11th. I will not forget that night. Bryce, one of the children, was always complaining that his birthday was ruined by nature. But at some point I no longer paid attention to his whining, since it was too late to think about such trifles. Full moon. I always thought that full moons were just old superstitions. But that night proved to me that you shouldn't always trust those beliefs. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise coming from the roof. At first I thought it was just a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal climbing the walls, but once I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the back stairs, it became clear to me that this was no ordinary noise. I shone the light on the roof but saw nothing. The noise stopped, and I felt the tension in the air become thick. It was strange, but I decided to ignore it and go back to the cabin. But something was wrong. I had only been asleep for a few hours when I suddenly woke up again. This time it was different. I heard footsteps, soft but distinct, on the wooden floors of our cabin. I opened my eyes and froze, feeling the cold creeping up on my body. But at some point it all stopped. I went outside, thinking it might be one of the kids out for a walk. But when I got to his bed, I realized something was wrong. The door was wide open, and one of the kids, Bryce, was gone. I ran into the forest. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my gut instinct told me I needed to act fast. I didn't know what to expect, but what I found wasn't what I thought. Bryce stood in the clearing, full length, completely still. He was shirtless, and his eyes were wide like a trapped animal. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, like he belonged in the woods. But when I looked further, I felt uneasy. There was something else standing behind him, a huge creature. Its eyes weren't like Bryce's. They were dark, almost deathly, and its long limbs seemed too long to be alive. I stood there, frozen, not believing my eyes. When I moved, Bryce didn't move. The creature took a few steps forward, sniffing the air as if it had sensed us. I didn't think any more. I grabbed Bryce's hand and ran back to camp. We ran without looking back, although something told me that the creature wasn't chasing us, but waiting. The next morning, everything was as usual. The camp director said that Bryce had been sleepwalking and that I shouldn't scare the kids with stories like that. But I knew that what I had seen was not a dream. It was real. From that day on, everything was different. With each passing day, the camp seemed more alien and unsettling. We continued to work with the children, monitor their activities, organize hikes and nightly campfires. But I could no longer help but notice how strange it all seemed. The forest, which had once seemed so picturesque, now looked ominous and unwelcoming. Each morning began with a quiet anxiety that I could not explain. It was difficult to understand what exactly was wrong, but something was. Too many things remained unclear, unresolved. Bryce was different after that night. He stopped talking. His eyes were no longer as lively as they used to be. This boy used to be a cheerful person. He often joked, argued with other children, and always tried to be the center of attention. Now he sat alone, silently watching the others. Sometimes he looked up, but his eyes were so empty and dark that I couldn't stand the sight of him. He didn't look like the Bryce I had just met. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't answer. Every time I tried to ask him about the night's events, he would just look at the ground or walk away without saying a word. I felt helpless. There was something strange in his gaze, as if he knew something he shouldn't have, and I didn't want to think about what could have caused this change, but I couldn't ignore the obvious. Things weren't as they should be. Logan had changed, too. He was my friend, with whom we had been through a lot, but in recent days he had become increasingly withdrawn. He would often go into the woods for hours at a time, and despite my questions, he would always answer briefly and somewhat evasively. I didn't feel comfortable around him, but I didn't know what to do. He didn't tell me what had happened that night, but I felt like he had something to hide. One night, when there was a full moon again, I was awakened by a strange noise. It wasn't the same sound I had heard that first time, but there was something familiar about it. My mind flashed back to those moments when I was trying to understand what was really happening. I jumped out of bed, quickly threw on my jacket, and ran outside. The same cold, piercing air that wrapped around me like an icy hand. I couldn't ignore this feeling that I was once again becoming part of something more terrible and inexplicable. When I approached the forest, everything was strangely quiet. I didn't hear a single rustle or rustle of leaves. It was as if nature itself had frozen, so as not to reveal what was hidden in the depths. My hand involuntarily reached for my pocket, where the flashlight was. When I turned it on, the light illuminated only a small part in front of me. The trees, like dark silhouettes, seemed threatening and hostile. Then, I heard a noise. It wasn't just a rustling or a swish of wind. It was a different sound, like someone was moving through the trees. I clutched the flashlight and moved forward, unable to stop. I couldn't just go back to camp without knowing what was lurking in these woods. I had to figure out what was going on here. A few minutes passed, and then I saw something strange. A shadow that quickly flashed between the trees. I quickened my steps, but the shadow disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the darkness of the night. And that's when I realized that something was wrong in these woods. I was sure that I was not alone, that this forest was watching me. And not just watching, it was hiding something. The next morning, everything was as usual again, but now there was a sense of oppression in the camp. As time went on, the shadow of what had happened to Bryce fell deeper and deeper on each of us. All the children became a little strange. They did not talk to each other, spending most of their time alone, as if they too sensed that something was wrong. I tried to keep my composure, but the anxiety wouldn't leave me. My thoughts swirled around the events, but they didn't bring me any answers. I thought again about what the camp director had told me. He claimed that the whole thing with Bryce was just an accident, that he was just sleepwalking. But everything that had happened in the last few days contradicted his words. I was sure that what I had seen that night was not a dream. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I knew one thing. There was much more to the Fernmore camp than it let on at first glance. My questions remained unanswered, but I could not shake the feeling that soon we would have to face something much more terrible, and this meeting was inevitable. I couldn't calm down. The fear I felt those nights grew with each passing day. I tried to talk to Logan, but he began to avoid my gaze more and more. His silence was no less frightening than all the strange things around the camp. It was as if he avoided discussing what had happened. And when I mentioned it, he only pressed his lips together, looking up into the void. Bryce, he became more and more distant, his eyes almost black, as if he had lost something important. I noticed how he didn't talk to the children, didn't participate in games, didn't laugh like he used to. Every time I tried to talk to him, he looked away, as if he was absorbed in something important, inaccessible to me. And then, one day, at the very moment when the full moon was close again, Bryce disappeared. I didn't even understand how it happened. I didn't hear his footsteps. I didn't notice him leaving. He just disappeared. I discovered he was gone when I checked on the kids before bed. The others were all there, sitting by the fire or sleeping peacefully in their tents, but he was gone. Just like the night I spotted him in the clearing, he had vanished, as if he had simply not been there. The same thoughts as before immediately flashed through my mind. This was no accident. At some point it became clear to me. Something that had happened to Bryce, something I couldn't explain, was at work again. My steps became faster and faster, and I felt fear squeeze my chest. I ran through the camp, calling his name, but no one answered. It was dark, and I could barely see anything in the distance. I turned toward the woods where I had seen him last time, when Bryce stood motionless, as if obeying something unseen. I kept moving forward, but the forest was as dead and lifeless as it had been that night. I was scared, but I couldn't stop. I had to find him. He was my responsibility. As I crossed the clearings past the trees, one thought hung unbearably in my head. What if this was not just a disappearance? What if this was something far more sinister than I could have imagined? Suddenly it seemed as if the forest began to overwhelm me. The shadows of the trees sank lower, as if nature itself was watching my every step. Suddenly, in one of the gaps, I saw something. The same light silhouette I had seen that very night, but this time it was hard to recognize. It wasn't just Bryce, it was something else. He stood there, just like before, completely still, but his eyes, they were empty, dark, like bottomless pits. I felt a chill run down my spine. I walked closer, holding the flashlight, but this time I couldn't light the way. The light didn't penetrate the dark branches of the trees, and instead it seemed as if the shadow itself was consuming everything around me. All I could see was Bryce's figure standing there. He was completely naked, just like that night, and his body didn't seem alive. It was just a shell. As I approached, he didn't move, didn't react. I felt the same fear again, as I had when he stood in the clearing, but that was not all. Something else was present next to him. I looked back in the direction the sound was coming from. In the darkness among the trees, I noticed movement, but it was not human. The sounds of hoarse breathing grew louder, and I realized that I was not alone. This entity was nearby. I ran. My legs moved like a machine, but my mind told me not to stop. I didn't remember how I got to the camp, but soon I found myself back, barely breathing, my hands shaking. That day I told Logan. He listened in silence, his face set in stone. "You're making this up again," he said, and I knew it was his defense, nothing more. But I couldn't stay silent any longer. I knew something was wrong at the camp. Bryce had disappeared again. This was no accident. I knew there was more to these woods than I could have imagined. The next day the camp was still open, the kids were playing, laughing, but I was sure of one thing. The camp was not safe. Everything that was happening here was part of something bigger, and I had to figure out what it was, and whatever it was, I knew it wouldn't leave us alone. No one knew what was waiting for us in these woods. When Bryce came back, it wasn't the same. He wasn't the same kid he used to be. He was withdrawn, his face had lost its sincerity, and his eyes were empty, like deep pits that had long since lost all life. I watched him, unable to look away. It was more than just a disappearance. It was as if there was no soul in his body anymore, and his behavior was becoming increasingly bizarre. I tried to talk to him, but he just remained silent. Sometimes I noticed his gaze become frozen, as if he were watching something invisible that moved in the shadows of the trees. But whatever it was, he paid no attention to me. His eyes became more and more expressionless with each passing day, until at some point I realized he was not who he used to be. He was a stranger. I began to notice other things, too. Little things that had seemed insignificant before suddenly became important. For example, at night, when I was checking the children's tents, I would sometimes hear strange sounds coming from the forest, only occasionally, but they were so deep and muffled that they did not give me peace. It was something like hoarse breathing or quiet footsteps, as if someone or something was following us. Every time I asked Logan what was going on, he just brushed me off. He wouldn't say anything specific. I could tell he was hiding something. There was the same fear in his eyes that I saw in my own. And even though he tried to act normal, I knew something was wrong. He was a part of it. Bryce wasn't the only one who started to change his behavior. I noticed that the other children were acting strange too. They would often wake up at night, their eyes full of terror, and sometimes they would just sit silently in dark corners, hunched over, as if they were afraid of something. In their conversations, they would increasingly mention dark places in the forest that none of us had ever known about. The children spoke of them with obvious horror, but also with some strange interest, as if they were attached to these places. There was no childish naivety in their words. These were the words of people who knew something. At that point, the camp was still open, but I felt like we were all becoming part of something terrible. I couldn't sleep at night, knowing that something evil was out there. It wasn't just a feeling of fear, it was a sense that the world around you was changing, that what you once knew no longer existed. The camp, the forest, even the sky felt hostile. And then one night, in the middle of the full moon, I was awakened again by a strange noise. This time it was louder. I was sure I heard footsteps. It wasn't something random. The steps were too sure and deep. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly crept out of the tent. Logan was still asleep, his breathing even, and I didn't wake him. I walked through the camp, trying to be quiet, but the further I went, the more clearly I heard those footsteps. They were coming towards me, as if someone was watching me. I quickly walked towards the woods, feeling my fear grow with each step. And then I saw him, Bryce. He was standing in the same place where I had seen him the first time, but this time he was truly terrifying. His face was blank, his eyes were black, and his body was strangely deformed. He stood there motionless, as if frozen. He did not react to me as he had the first time. I approached him, but I could not touch him. I felt something evil in the air. I did not know what it was, but I knew I could not stay here. And as soon as I turned to run, I felt something huge reaching for me. I felt this cold, this deep fear that squeezed my chest. My body did not obey. I tried to run, but the footsteps did not stop. I turned around and saw it, that same monster. It was huge, several times larger than Bryce, and its body was covered in dark fur. But it wasn't an animal. It was something else. A creature that defied explanation. Its eyes were dull, but I could feel its gaze piercing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to run. My legs carried me back to camp, and when I reached my camp, I couldn't calm down. I was panicking. My heart was pounding, and my breathing was ragged. Logan woke up when I entered the tent. He didn't say anything, but his eyes said it all. We both knew we couldn't stay here. We both knew the camp, these woods, they weren't safe. But in that moment, sitting next to him in the tent, I realized we were both part of something we couldn't understand. And the worst part was that I knew that if this thing really existed, it would keep coming back. A few weeks had passed since the camp had closed, and life seemed to have returned to normal. I tried to forget everything that had happened at Fernmoor and get on with my life. But every day as I returned home, I felt a heaviness in my heart. It wasn't exactly fear, but rather a sense of an unsolved mystery that would not leave me alone. The thought that there was something else lurking in these woods, something I couldn't understand, and that no explanation could possibly capture, kept swirling around in my head. Every time I drove past Michigan, when I saw the thick woods that hid this camp, something in my chest tightened. It was as if the forest was alive, and it knew of my weakness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to return. One day, sitting at home, I found it hard to look out the window without thinking about the camp. Logan was gone from my sight, changed somehow. I knew he was also haunted by what we had experienced. But he had vanished without a word, just like everyone else who had once been associated with the camp. I couldn't find him on my phone or on social media. It was as if he had vanished. Time passed, but the nagging thought of the camp would not let go. I could not understand why it continued to haunt me, why I could not simply forget. It was not just curiosity. It was like an internal demand. I felt that if I did not return there, I would live with this for the rest of my days. I had to find answers, solve the mystery that tormented me. Everything that happened after that terrible incident began to take on a different hue. It became clear to me that the events we had experienced were only the tip of the iceberg, and the worst was hidden in what we had not seen and understood then. Bryce, with his dark eyes, who disappeared into the night, was no longer himself. This was not just an accident, not the accidental loss of a child. It was something much deeper, something connected to the camp itself and its secret, to what they were hiding. I started looking for information about the Fernmoor camp, but the more I looked, the less I found. All the camp's archives were hidden, old records were erased, and all information related to its closure in the 90s was mysteriously missing. Someone clearly wanted these events to remain in the shadows. Then I decided I had to go back there. Logan was gone, but I couldn't live with what I didn't know. I took the car and drove back to Michigan. This time I was ready to see everything they were trying to hide. The road to the camp was long and tiring. Everything seemed the same as before, but now I saw the path differently. The forests were darker, as if they remembered me, remembered what I had gone through. And then, finally, I found myself there. The camp had not changed in appearance. The same abandoned houses, the same overgrown paths, but everything was completely different. The camp was covered in a veil of fog that seemed unreal. I walked through the old wooden gate and headed toward the main buildings. With every step I took, I felt a tension building in my chest. It wasn't just excitement, but an inner feeling that I was trapped, that I was getting too close to something that wasn't meant for human eyes. Everything was lifelessly silent, but I knew it was an illusion. I felt my feet slowing as I approached the very building where the incident with Bryce had taken place. I looked at its facade, and fragments of the events I had experienced there floated into my mind. The windows seemed to be watching me, and the mossy roof and cracked walls seemed to silently observe my every move. Here, among these empty and forgotten buildings, I felt something more than just fear. I felt the presence of something unearthly, as if the camp itself were a living thing, and I was not a welcome guest. Everything inside me protested. but I kept going. As I approached the central building, I noticed that the door that had once been locked was now slightly ajar. I slowly pushed it open and it creaked softly, revealing a way inside. This building was not like the one I remembered. It was dark and cold. The floors were covered in dust and moss, but there was a strange, heavy atmosphere in the air. I felt like something was watching me. I stepped inside and the air was thick with a smell of damp and decay. The dark corners were still cold and shadowy, and the old walls seemed besieged by some invisible presence. The camp didn't seem to want me here. In that building, I began to search for anything that could explain what was happening. I found old magazines, books, and photographs that didn't seem to belong there, and with every page, with every step deeper, I felt my connection to that place grow stronger. The darkness around me became tangible, like something alive. Hours passed as I wandered through this abandoned building, sinking deeper and deeper into its dark corners. I felt like a man walking on thin ice, with every step likely to send me falling into the unknown. The air was thick and dusty, as if no one had been here for a long time and perhaps never would be, but the more I explored, the clearer it became that this place wasn't as empty as I'd thought. Deep inside the building, I found an old basement. The steps leading down were slippery from moisture and time, and I had to carefully descend, trying not to slip. The darkness around was so thick that it seemed to absorb the light of the flashlight, which barely illuminated the way. When I got down there, I realized that this wasn't just a basement. This was the center of the camp, its heart. Things were kept here, hidden from the eyes of most. On the shelves were old, dusty boxes that might have once held records of those who had been here. I opened one of the boxes and found photographs. They were of children, the same children I had once accompanied, only these pictures had been taken many years ago. They all looked happy, and their faces were full of hope, but I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't expect to find what I saw. Hidden in the far corner of the basement floor was a strange, tattered old rug. I lifted it, and underneath it was something terrifying, a door, a piece of metal covered in a layer of rust and tightly closed. It wasn't just a door, it was something that was clearly not meant to be seen. The door seemed to hide something that wasn't meant to be found. I felt my chest tighten. My heart was pounding and everything inside me was screaming at me to just get out of here, but something else, something much stronger was driving me on. I leaned against the door and tried to open it. It resisted, but eventually it gave way and I felt cold air hit my face. When I looked inside, I was immediately overcome by a strange, indescribable fear. It was a space that looked like a room, but not like the others. Everything here was covered in something that I couldn't immediately make out. There was a heavy, suffocating darkness in the air that overwhelmed all my senses. I felt my body begin to tense up, as if I shouldn't be here. I walked inside and immediately noticed something strange. There were traces on the floor, left by something or someone. These were not just traces, but traces that could not belong to a person. Strange, unnatural, as if someone with huge claws had moved around this place. Here, in this place where everything seemed forgotten and covered by time, I saw her, lying on an old wooden table. It was not a photograph, not an object, but something alive. For a second I thought it was just a shadow, a reflection in dark glass, but I realized it was something much more sinister. An ancient doll lay before me, its face twisted in terror. It was made of something strange. Its human-like skin was covered in cracks, and its eyes seemed to follow my every move. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't just a toy. It was a message, and somehow it was connected to what was happening at the camp. I didn't know what it was. The doll looked like an artifact, forgotten and hidden from everyone, but it wasn't alone. In the other corner of the room was a small table with a row of similar dolls. They were all in the same condition, covered in cracks, with disfigured faces and empty eyes, making them look as if they had witnessed something horrific. I realized that this place wasn't just an abandoned camp. It was a place where something was happening that couldn't be explained. Maybe these dolls were part of some ritual, part of something darker than I could imagine. As soon as I picked up one of the dolls, I felt cold. It wasn't just a physical cold. It was like I was touching something ancient and dangerous. I dropped it and jumped back sharply, feeling the darkness engulf me. I looked around, but the shadows seemed alive, as if they were surrounding me from all sides. I knew I had to leave. I knew this place wasn't meant for me, But when I turned to the door to leave the basement, I noticed it was locked. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. At that moment, I realized that here, within these walls, I was not just a victim of circumstances. I had become a part of this place, and nothing could take me out of here. Several days had passed since I had been locked in the basement. At first, I tried to convince myself that everything I had seen was just the result of fatigue, stress, and fear. But the more time I spent in the camp, the clearer it became that this place was much more than just a deserted area. I could no longer ignore the sensations that haunted me. The darkness that lurked in every corner of this camp seemed to have a life of its own. There was constant rustling in the darkness, and I could hear strange creatures moving in the forest that surrounded the camp. They were always nearby, but I couldn't figure out what exactly they were. Every night I heard them. They weren't just the sounds of wind or animals. They were footsteps, the scraping of claws, deep, suffocating breaths, like something or someone was watching me, but always at a distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something lived in these woods, and it wasn't kind. After I discovered that strange basement, it became clear to me that the camp was hiding terrible secrets. But the more I investigated, the more I realized that this camp wasn't just abandoned. It was left to hide something that shouldn't fall into the wrong hands. The camp wasn't just a home for children. It was part of something much more sinister. I started seeing strange signs painted on trees, marks left by some creature that couldn't be human. It was all part of something that had happened in this place many years ago, and maybe was happening again. A few days passed, and I began to notice how the people around me were changing. The children at the camp were becoming more and more strange. They looked healthy, but their eyes, their behavior, everything was different. I couldn't understand what was happening to them, but one thing was clear. The camp was changing, and its dark forces were becoming stronger. Bryce was the first to be affected, but I began to notice that the other kids were changing too. They were becoming more withdrawn. Their behavior was becoming strange. It was as if they were under someone's control. It wasn't what I had thought before. It was something more terrifying than I could have imagined. I searched for answers, but with each passing day it became more and more difficult to understand what was happening in this place. The camp, which had once been filled with joy and laughter, now seemed empty and ominous. The walls were soaked with something dark, making the air feel heavy and impenetrable. And then one night when I was alone in the woods again, I felt something was wrong. I wasn't alone, I knew it, and I felt this shadow coming towards me. I turned and saw it, the thing I had once seen in the clearing with Bryce. But now it was closer, much closer. It stood before me, absorbing the light, not letting me know what it really was. I couldn't tell what it was. It looked human, but there was nothing human in its eyes. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It felt like a dream, but I knew it wasn't. This was real. I was standing in front of this thing, and it was looking at me, as if it was expecting something. I tried to remember everything I knew about the camp, everything that happened here, but I couldn't connect the dots. The creature didn't move, it just stood there, its eyes filled with emptiness, looking at me. It was a feeling I couldn't explain. I felt something dull and cold taking hold of me, and that's when I knew I shouldn't have stayed here. I had to leave, get away from this place before it consumed me like it had consumed the others. But I knew it was too late. I was part of this camp, and all I could do was wait. Story 5. Tonight, a dead god awakens. I don't know what comes next. But something in me, something very deep, something that dreads his grace, something that is still mine, must speak before it disappears, before I forget what it is like to be myself. I have witnessed horror, not just fear, not just anxiety. No, I have witnessed something sacred and wrong, damned. And before this horror does something unspeakable to me, before my very essence is lost to me, I need you to know everything. I always thought of Liam as an eccentric but talented sculptor. His studio is a world of its own, filled with the smell of sawdust, paint, the hum of machines. It is a place where art is born from wood and plaster, where each figure seems alive. But it is not just art. It is something more. Until now. This morning he left early, as always, to meet potential clients outside the city. He was sure he would return only at night, and his confidence, his calmness, it was strange. strange and alarming. He trusted me to take care of his house, his workshop as always, but this time something was different. I was alone in his house, which was strange because I was used to his presence, to the noise downstairs, to the sounds of him working. The workshop was his place, and I was just an assistant, someone who helped organize orders, keep track of incoming orders. Routine work, boring, but it left no time for questions. But on this day, when Liam was not around, something in the house was wrong. After the morning routine, dealing with clients who, as always, were hesitant to come themselves, I went to the studio. My steps were quiet. Everything was as usual, nothing foreshadowed trouble. But as soon as I entered the basement, something inside me told me that this would not be an ordinary day. The light flickered when I flicked the switch. Even in the darkness, in this semi-darkness, the studio seemed alive. The shadows of the figures covered in fabrics seemed strangely correct, almost real. Liam had always been a master, and I was proud to help him, but at that moment I felt something unbearably strange. With each step, I felt the tension grow. The air below became heavy. It took me a moment to realize what it was. At first, it was just a shadow hidden in the far corner. But as I approached, I froze. I saw it. It was there, exposed in the corner, unveiled, naked. Its body was black, charred, as if it had been carved from wood that had been burned in a fire. Its skin was covered in ash and soot, as if the figure had been through something horrific. Its features were human, but somehow wrong. I couldn't understand why its eyes were so frightening. White, lifeless, with black pupils, they seemed to stare at me, as if they saw more than I could comprehend. I didn't know how to react. This wasn't just a mannequin. This was something else. His face was strangely submissive, his lips slightly curved in a grin, and this grin seemed sinister, as if it was intended not to please, but to frighten. I felt myself become cold, very cold. My body was filled with tension, but I could not take my eyes off this creature. It stood as if it were alive. Despite everything obvious, it was not alive. And suddenly it became clear to me that this wasn't just a project. This wasn't just another mannequin for a client. This was something personal. Liam had always been a skilled sculptor, and sometimes his work was out of the ordinary. But this was something else entirely. I thought that maybe this was one of those projects he'd never shown. Maybe this was his secret, his hidden work, toiling away in solitude. But why had he left it like this? Why had he left it unmarked, unlabeled? It couldn't just be that figure standing there, among the others, unseen by anyone. I dug around in the trash can next to his desk. I found several crumpled sheets of paper, sketches. Most of them were vague, rough scribbles, but one stood out. The handwriting was crooked, not like Liam's. The lines were not entirely clear, as if they had been written in a hurry or with some kind of inner tension. You had dark and short hair, a man with a coal face. You upset us, but in you we saw God, a dead God. I couldn't understand what it meant. Dead God? What kind of words were those? I was upset, and after throwing away the papers, I began to think that it was just his creative inspiration. I turned off the light and left the basement, but when I closed the gallery door behind me, I heard a crash, as if something had fallen. I couldn't help but go back. It was the same figure. It fell face down. I didn't understand how. Remembering it, I still feel my body tighten. I picked it up, set it against the wall again, but I smelled it. Acrid, deadly, like a charred body. Its surface was warm, as if it had just been burned. My hand froze when I felt that its texture was unusual, smooth, like human skin. I felt my heart beat faster. I quickly ran out of the basement, closing the door automatically. And although my hands were clean, it seemed to me that they were covered with something invisible. I closed the door behind me, quickly looking back, and in the darkness I saw his face again. His smile, which seemed too alive, too mocking, as if he was pleased with what I had done. I felt his eyes following me, even though I was sure that couldn't be happening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I ran upstairs, locking the basement door and trying to ignore the strange thoughts that wouldn't leave me. But even up there in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching me. The more I tried to convince myself that none of this mattered, the more dread I felt in my chest. Every movement became harder, and with every step I took, I could feel that smell, acrid and bitter, not leaving me. It seeped into my lungs, became part of the air I breathed. It was impossible to ignore it, to forget what had happened in the studio. I couldn't shake the memory of the figure standing there, in the corner, looking at me with its lifeless eyes. I tried to push away my nervousness, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. How could that thing move? How did it fall? And why did I feel like something important happened the moment I picked it up? Liam must know what it was, right? Maybe he just decided to leave it like that? He wasn't one to hide his work. He always took pride in what he did, and if it had been a regular piece of art, he wouldn't have left it in the basement without a word about it. I couldn't leave it like that. This feeling that something was unfinished was nagging at me. Something about that mannequin, something about its strange, charred texture, wasn't just art. It was so much more. All day I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind, that I was exaggerating, that Liam wasn't like that he wouldn't create something so scary. But despite my efforts, I couldn't sleep that night. I replayed in my mind the moment I'd accidentally left the figure on the floor, its disfigured face, its empty eyes that seemed more and more meaningful. To remember exactly when I fell asleep, but when I woke up it was late, the darkness gathering outside. The house was strangely quiet, and I realized that Liam had not returned. There was a sense of foreboding inside me, as if something important had remained unsolved. He should have been here, and now his absence was beginning to take on a weight, heavy, oppressive. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen where a cup of cold coffee was standing. I sat at the table, thinking about what to do. Liam was usually reserved, didn't like to talk without a reason, but today I missed his confidence. I didn't know why, but every moment without him became more and more strange. I tried to talk myself out of worry, but the anxiety grew with each passing minute. And that's when I noticed that the workshop doors were open. I stood there, looking at them, trying to figure out how and when they had opened. I clearly remembered that before leaving I had closed them, checked them carefully. Someone had to have come in. I knew I hadn't done it myself. I walked up to the door and felt a chill run down my spine. Holding my breath, I pushed the door open. And just like that moment in the basement, I immediately felt a strange, sharp silence. Everything was the same as before. The same lighting, the same carelessly scattered furniture as in the morning. But there, in the very center, stood a figure. The same one, but now it was in a different position. It was turned towards me. I couldn't understand how it had ended up in this position, how it could have moved. My heart sank and I felt my chest freeze. It was impossible. I was sure I had left her against the wall. How could she be right in front of the door, looking at me? I couldn't stand still. I went inside and walked around the figure, looking at its face. It was horrible. Its expression had changed. Its eyes were brighter now, as if they were trying to say something. I felt how hard it was to breathe, how the air became thicker, how this strange feeling of anxiety enveloped me completely. I stood in front of it, unable to move. Everything in my body protested against me continuing to look at it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about that look made me feel like I was losing control, like I was standing in a room with some horrible creature who was just waiting for me to make a mistake. I tried to take a step back, but my legs felt like stone. My body wouldn't obey. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something that went deeper. And then I heard footsteps. They were barely audible, but I knew they were footsteps. Silent, almost invisible, but they were undeniable. I turned and froze. Liam was standing in the doorway. His face was calm, but his eyes, they were different. They were empty, lifeless, like that figure, like a sculpture. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He was just standing there, looking at me. I felt that strange coldness coming over me again. Everything in the world turned upside down. He was here, but he wasn't, and I realized that there was no way out of this game. My heart was pounding, and my breathing seemed ragged and unnatural. Liam stood in the doorway of the studio, his gaze unwavering, as if I were part of the painting he had created. I felt his eyes piercing me, as if I had no right to be in this place, in this reality. It was so quiet I could almost hear the seconds ticking by, dissolving into the emptiness between us. I tried to find the words, but they seemed to be stuck in my throat. I couldn't believe that he looked as if nothing had happened, as if there was no strange mannequin in the basement, no absence. He was here, but at the same time I felt like there was a gap between us, invisible but tangible. I tried to say something, but my voice was weak, almost inaudible. "Liam, "What's going on?" I finally blurted out. He didn't answer, but his face changed slightly and his gaze became even more empty. He stepped into the workshop, and in that moment I felt the cold creep into the air. He walked past me without looking and walked toward the figure standing in the middle of the room. I froze, not knowing what to do, how to react. All I wanted was to find an explanation for what was happening and bring some normality back to this strange night. Liam stopped in front of the mannequin. He was as silent as ever, but something about his presence was different now. He wasn't touching the figure, but its face was lit in a peculiar way, unnaturally, as if something invisible was working on it, giving it a terrible, almost human life. I stood there, unable to move. "Did you find something?" I said these words, not even believing that I was saying them. They sounded like a scream from inside. Liam didn't answer. He didn't walk toward me. He didn't turn. He kept looking at the figure. He seemed absorbed in something invisible that was happening between them, as if he was connected to her in some way I couldn't understand. "Liam, tell me, what's going on? Why aren't you talking?" I couldn't stay silent any longer. My voice was hoarse, full of despair. I didn't know what he saw, what he felt, but I had this feeling that this wasn't normal. This wasn't human. He finally turned to me, his face set like a stone mask. He looked straight into my eyes, but there was something different about his gaze. He didn't see me. He wasn't here. He was different. You don't have to understand this. His voice was quiet, like a whisper, but there was something ominous in it that made my body tremble. I couldn't understand what he meant. His words seemed strange and frightening, as if they didn't belong to him. I stood there, unable to move, feeling myself sink deeper and deeper into the same emptiness that had enveloped him. "Liam, you're scaring me." I couldn't hide my confusion and fear any longer. "Who is this? What was that in the basement?" "You say I shouldn't understand this, but I can't help but understand. This is all not normal. This is all not real." He took a step toward me, but his steps were strangely slow, as if he wasn't quite there. His movements seemed distant, as if he were in some kind of trance. I tried to back away, but it seemed as if I couldn't get away from him, as if his presence filled every space in the room. "Don't you dare leave," he said, and I felt his words seeping into me, paralyzing my thoughts. "You don't understand. You don't see what I see." I couldn't understand his words, but they echoed in my heart with some kind of incomprehensible fear. I couldn't understand why, but now I felt that all this was not an accident. All this had long been predetermined, and I could neither stop nor change the course of events. I suddenly realized that there was more to this than just the mannequin, or even Liam. I felt like this wasn't just art or just a weird hobby. It was a curse. It was something that had been in power for a long time, and now I was part of this game that couldn't be stopped. I tried to remember everything that had happened in the last few weeks, but everything was jumbled in my head. There were no clear memories, no clarity. It was like I was in a nightmare where time didn't exist, and every action only led to a new depth of horror. "You can't leave here," Liam said, but I didn't hear any anger or fear in his voice. It was as cold as everything around us. "You're already here. This is your choice." There was no regret in his words. They were as direct as a sentence. I felt my legs buckle, but I couldn't take a step. My gaze slid back to the mannequin, and it became clear to me this figure was no longer just part of a painting. It was a monster standing before me, and Liam knew he couldn't run from it, and neither could I. I tried to understand what was happening. My thoughts were jumbled. It couldn't be like this. None of this felt real. Liam, who was next to me, seemed to be disappearing, dissolving into thin air, into this strange coldness that filled the room. I stood motionless, unable to take a step. My gaze was still fixed on the mannequin. It was in the center of the room, as always, but now there was something different about it. I could feel its metal eyes watching me. Although they couldn't be alive, it was just a figure, without flesh, without a soul. But it felt like he wasn't like that, and Liam knew that I felt it. There was a strange, unnatural calm in the room. It was as if time had stopped here. I could have thought that this was just a bad dream, but this anxiety, this cold that permeated the air, could not be part of a dream. I could feel it on my skin, feel how it pulled me into some kind of emptiness. I wanted to turn and leave, but my legs wouldn't obey me. They felt like they were tied to the floor, as if the room itself had become part of this nightmare. I was afraid, but I couldn't figure out what I was afraid of. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation for everything that was happening. But it couldn't. I tried to remember some semblance of normalcy, something that would make me believe that it was still possible to go back. But nothing came. The silence, the cold, and Liam, who wasn't Liam, but someone I couldn't understand. It was strange, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt everything around me shrinking. The air was heavy, and every movement, even the slightest, seemed like an echo, a reverberation of something hidden. I looked around, trying to find some trace of reality, something familiar, but the whole room was alien. Everything was locked in this strange state. Mannequin. The word kept spinning around in my head. I tried to figure out what was wrong with him. He wasn't just part of the decor. He was part of something bigger, part of that shadow that followed my every step. I couldn't look away, even though it hurt. He stood there like a dead thing, but also like something alive, something watching me, something sensing me. It became clear to me in that moment that he was part of this place and therefore part of Liam. Liam. As soon as I thought about it, everything intensified. He was close, but so far away that I couldn't tell where he was or who he was. His movements were unnatural. He was both here and not there. There was something alien about him. He still stood in front of the mannequin, not moving, but his shadow seemed to hang in the air, like something elusive. He was a part of that shadow, and now I was, too. We were like parts of something that existed outside of time and logic. My thoughts felt like they were lost in an endless loop, trying to get back to reality but finding no way out. The fear I felt was so strong that every move I made was an effort. I knew I couldn't just leave. I was here, trapped in this nightmare, like Liam was trapped in his shadow, and the mannequin standing before him was something we couldn't ignore. I felt something shift in the air. Liam didn't move, and I didn't move, but the room began to shrink, as if the space around us was being controlled by some force. I couldn't understand what was happening, but this room, this house, everything felt inescapably alien. I could feel my body reacting to this changed world. I couldn't look at Liam anymore. I couldn't look at the mannequin, and yet my gaze was drawn to them. At some point, I felt that if I stayed here, if I continued to stand in this place, I would forever become part of this evil, part of this nightmare. I couldn't allow that. But my legs still refused to obey, not wanting to move. I didn't know what to do anymore. Didn't know how to free myself from this heavy, suffocating feeling. All that was left was to stand and wait. When I came to, the first thing I realized was the same cold that was penetrating me to the depths of my soul. I was lying on the floor, and everything around me seemed unusually quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't just emptiness, but a feeling that something was happening in every cell of my body. Almost instinctively I tried to get up, but my arms felt like they were fettered by a weight, as if the weight of the air was pressing down on me. Every movement was difficult. My heart was pounding, and I was having trouble catching my breath. I could barely process how I had ended up on the floor, but despite the pain, I felt something else. Not just physical anxiety, but fear. Fear of what was happening in this house, in this room. I didn't know what was happening, but what I was feeling was unsettling. It became clear to me at that moment that nothing I had seen or experienced made sense in any normal sense. I knelt down, but the entire room in front of me suddenly changed. The walls seemed blurry, as if I was in a space where time and space did not obey the usual laws. Everything was close and far away at the same time. I felt the weight wrap around my body again, like I was trapped again. But this time I knew I couldn't give in. I looked around. Liam, he was there, standing as still as ever. But something was wrong. His face, his expression, it was alien, cold. I couldn't place it, but it wasn't the Liam I knew. His eyes were empty, and there was no human spark in them. Most likely I was wrong again, because something inside me kept telling me that I should believe in my feelings and not in what my eyes were showing me. I tried to keep myself from panicking, from crying. I needed to be strong. I took a few steps, trying to reach the window, but before I could touch the glass, the entire room suddenly changed again. In this new space, all the familiar elements disappeared. The walls were covered in fog, and I felt the cold seeping into my skin, into every thought. I realized that I was being watched. Someone was watching me, and it wasn't Liam, something else. I turned around, and there was the mannequin again. It was there, but now its form seemed alive. It was more than just an object, more than just a thing in this house. Its eyes weren't just glassy, they glowed with a cold light that permeated me from the inside. I felt its gaze piercing me, as if this mannequin knew something I shouldn't know. I couldn't stay here any longer. Every moment in this house brought me new experiences that I couldn't explain, but they were real. I had to find a way out. I couldn't stay in this strange world. I knew I had to leave, but how? How to get out of this nightmare? I stepped toward the door that had once been familiar but now seemed as foreign as everything else here. It was almost painful to look at. As I touched the handle, a sudden flash of light blinded me. Everything around me turned again, and I found myself in darkness. It was hard to concentrate, but I could feel my body growing heavy, each breath becoming harder and harder. Something was holding me back. My entire reality was crumbling before my eyes, and I could no longer tell what was real and what was just my imagination. But one thing was clear. I couldn't trust this house. I couldn't trust Liam or the mannequin. Everything I felt told me this place was dangerous. This wasn't home. This was something else, something sinister, feeding on my fears and doubts. I looked around again for Liam, but he was gone. Instead, there was only that mannequin standing before me. I realized that he wasn't something to be afraid of. What scared me most wasn't what I saw, but what I couldn't understand. Where had he gone? Why had everything changed so much? How could something so strange still exist? I slowly approached it, and despite everything that was happening around me, I touched its cold surface. At that moment, something inside me tightened. The answer was somewhere nearby. Everything that was happening was part of something bigger, a part that I had to recognize, but it didn't. The silence was deafening. Something inside me was clenching, as if this empty house could swallow me, dissolve me into its abyss. I stood before the mannequin, feeling its coldness penetrate my fingers. It was only an artificial object, but I felt that it was hiding something terrible. This world, this place, everything seemed too unreal, like a flickering shadow that disappeared as soon as I tried to touch it. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't believe that it was just my imagination. My footsteps echoed through the rooms, creating a strange contrast to the oppressive silence. Every breath I took was noticeable, as if the air itself was too heavy to pass through. I felt my eyes begin to water again, and the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. My head was already refusing to work. I couldn't focus, and my thoughts were blurry. With every step I took, I felt like I was slipping further and further away from reality, and returning to it was becoming impossible. When I looked around again, I noticed that there were new shadows on the walls. There weren't any before, and they weren't just shadows, they were shapes, outlines that didn't belong in this world. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This house wasn't just old. It wasn't just the place where I spent my life before everything changed. It was something that knew I was here, that I was feeling, and that it would continue to torment me until I found an answer. I went to the window, but when I looked out, I noticed that the night was not ending. It was dark outside, but not as dark as usual. Everything around was like a bad dream. I could not understand what exactly was wrong, but there was something in this space that did not give me peace. Something stirred in my consciousness. Instantly, I knew I was not alone, and it wasn't just a feeling. I knew someone was watching me, but it wasn't a human gaze. It was something that should have remained in the shadows, but it was trying to pull me into its emptiness. And then I remembered Liam. He was gone. Everything I remembered about him seemed to have fallen apart, turning into chaos that defied explanation. It was strange that I didn't process his disappearance the way I would have expected. Instead of despair, I felt something else. A strange calm, as if I already knew he wouldn't come back. Or maybe he'd never been here. As soon as that thought crossed my mind, it became clearer. All this time I had been trying to find an answer in him, believing that Liam was the one who would help me make sense of everything that had happened. But what if he hadn't been in that house to begin with? What if this whole nightmare hadn't been created by him, but by something darker? I realized that all these events, the disappearance, the mannequin, the strange shadows, the strange changes in this house, were part of something much bigger than I could imagine. I couldn't stay here any longer, but how could I get out? I didn't know what to do. This house was full of traps, and every attempt to get out only made the situation more difficult. I tried to remember every moment, every movement, every rustle, but they all merged into something that eluded me like a fog that cannot be grasped by hands. There was no point in giving up. I took a few steps towards the doors, but when I tried to open them, they wouldn't budge. Nothing happened. I pulled the handle, but it was locked, as if the house itself didn't want to let me out. With every effort, the door handle became colder and heavier. It seemed that the house knew I wanted to leave, and it wasn't going to let me go. I felt the fear creeping up on me. This house wasn't just empty. It was alive, in a way. It knew who I was. It knew what I was looking for, and it wasn't going to let me go, until I realized that everything I'd been through was just the beginning.